So pretty much why the Fed moved to an ample reserve system. So before 2008, the Fed operated under a limited reserve system. Banks could only lend out if they had enough reserves, and the Fed had to pretty much actively manage all of those reserves every single day. And those small fluctuations caused large swings in the federal funds rate, which made monetary policy hard to control. So pretty much to improve the stability, they moved to an ample reserve system. Now banks hold more reserves than it is strictly required. So this allowed the Fed to better control the interest rates without adjusting the total supply of reserves daily. More money. And to draw out an ample reserves graph, what you have to do is you got the interest rate here, that's the vertical axis, and the horizontal one is the quantity of reserves. Yeah, we got the discount rate going down like this. And the vertical axis, and that's the horizontal supply of resources. It's going to be the ample one, and this is going to be the downward sloping demand curve for reserves. So in an ample reserve system, the Fed supplies plenty of resources, making the supply curve almost horizontal in the target range. And banks' demand for reserves slopes downwards, and at higher interest rate, they need fewer resources for pretty much just overnight resources. So that's demand that becomes downward sloping. This year's limited reserves, the upper end at the discount rate, and at the lower end of the interest rate is going to be the ample reserve. We'll write that down. This is going to be the discount rate and interest on reserves. And pretty much how the Fed controls the federal fund rates is the Fed sets the federal fund rates target by paying interest on excess reserves, and banks will not lend reserves at a lower rate than the IOER, which pretty much just sets the floor. So the Fed can use overnight reverse repurchase agreements to pretty much just set the ceiling, and all of this together keeps the federal funds rates within the target range, while actively adjusting the total quantity of reserves that they have. Floor is ceiling, so stays in target range. And pretty much just using monetary policy to close the recessionary gap. What's going to happen is, and for the fourth one, we're just going to draw a draw the graph. So the vertical axis is going to be the price level, and horizontal is going to be the real GDP. And we got long run aggregate supply, and we got aggregate demand, and short run aggregate supply. But as you can see here, the economy is currently producing below the potential GDP, and it created a recessionary gap. So this is where the initial aggregate demand intersects pretty much short run supply, and we got Fed action. So you see we're going to shift this 80 to the right, And to close the recessionary gap, the Fed lowers the target range for short-term interest rates, and this makes borrowing cheaper, so investment and consumption both rise, and this pretty much just shifts aggregate demand to the right. And after this Fed's action, pretty much the aggregate demand actually increases, and this moves the equilibrium output closer to the potential GDP, pretty much partially or fully closing the recessionary gap. By adjusting the target range in an ample reserve system, the Fed lowers the short-term interest rates, which stimulates more spending and more investments, which in turn leads to the AD shifting right and moves the economy towards more full employment. And now we're gonna do the last FRQ. So first off, I'm just gonna draw the X and Y axis. It should be price level with a vertical axis, and it should be real GDP. And I'm gonna draw a vertical line, which is gonna be the long run aggregate supply. And upward sloping curve, which has to be short run aggregate supply, and it's going to be aggregate demand, and this is all going to be in the recessionary position because aggregate demand is downward sloping and just intersects the short run aggregate supply to the left of YF. So pretty much the intersection that we have here is the x-axis is gonna be y1, the y-axis is going to be PPL1, right? The current short run equilibrium output is as y1, and the price level is going to be at PL2. And now, because y1 is less than yf, the economy is in a recessionary gap with unemployment above the natural rate. So, to move the economy towards pretty much long-term equilibrium, the central bank should be implementing a monetary policy by lowering its target range for short-term investment rates in the ample reserve system, which is going to just decrease the interest rates and increase investment and increase consumption, and that will shift the demand to the right back towards full employment output. Okay, so the last one, we're just going to draw a graph. The vertical side is going to be policy rate, and the horizontal is going to be quantity of reserves. And now we're going to draw the demand curve, which is going to be this downward sloping line. That's going to be the demand curve. And the Z-shaped curve is just going to represent the bank's demand for reserves, and on the left, when reserves are scarce, banks compete for them, so this raises the rate steeply. But on the right, when there's a lot of reserves, the rate stays near the Fed's interest on excess reserves. So, and we're also going to draw the initial supply of reserves, and we're going to put that as MS. The vertical line just shows the total reserves supplied by the Fed, which they can actually control pretty much directly. And you see this intersection here. We're just going to label this as PR, because at this intersection, what happens is that the current policy rate and the reserve quantity determine the short run equilibrium. The economy is currently overheating because unemployment is below its natural rate, and pretty much what the Fed needs to do is to cool the economy. They need to implement a contradictory monetary policy, such as reducing reserves. So we're going to shift the vertical supply line left. And to move the economy toward long-run equilibrium, the Fed reduces supply of reserves. shifting the vertical line left. So this reduces the quantity of reserves available to banks. And this equilibrium, this new equilibrium pretty much shows a higher policy rate. This higher rate actually discourages people borrowing and spending, so investment and consuming both goes down, and it slows aggregate demand, which moves output back towards like the full employment output.